The desert stretched endlessly before her, a vast golden silence under the relentless Arizona sun. Lena adjusted the strap of her camera bag and squinted at the horizon. The air shimmered like molten glass, and every step stirred up a puff of red dust that clung to her boots. She had been driving for hours along a winding dirt road that didn't appear on most maps, chasing light, chasing stories, chasing something she couldn't quite name. Photography had always been her way of searching. Every frame she captured was an attempt to understand beauty, pain, and the small mysteries of being human. But lately the pictures had stopped meaning anything. Her exhibitions were successful, her name respected in art circles. But when she looked through her lens, all she saw was distance, between her and her subjects, between herself and the world. She was tired of cities and galleries and the noise of people who pretended to understand life through filters and captions. So she came here to the desert where nothing could hide. The land was raw, uncluttered, honest. She thought if she could photograph the silence, maybe she'd remember how to listen. It was nearing late afternoon, the hour when the sun softened and turned the sand into liquid gold. She parked her Jeep near a cluster of red rocks that rose from the earth like sleeping giants. Her GPS had long since lost signal. She didn't mind. She preferred it that way. Freedom, she thought, didn't need coordinates. With her camera hanging from her neck, Lena climbed up the narrow trail that wound between the rocks. The wind whispered low, carrying the faint scent of creosote and sage. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, a lonely, sharp sound that vanished into the heat. She paused on a ledge and raised her camera. The desert unfolded before her, a canvas of ochre and shadow, broken only by thin green veins of cactus and brittle shrubs. The land seemed alive, breathing slowly beneath the sun. She clicked the shutter once, twice. The sound echoed faintly off the stone. As she lowered her camera, a movement caught her eye. Down below, beyond the ridge, a small glint, like light bouncing off water. That didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been any water here. Not in this stretch of parched land. Curiosity sparked in her chest. She glanced at the sun. 2 hours till sunset. Enough time to explore. She made her way down carefully, one hand brushing the warm rock for balance. The path grew steeper, then opened into a narrow canyon. The air cooled slightly and she could hear something, faint but unmistakable, the trickle of running water. A stream, out here? When she reached the bottom, she stopped in astonishment. Hidden between the cliffs was a small spring, its surface trembling with tiny ripples. A patch of green surrounded it, ferns, wild grass, and white desert lilies bending gently in the breeze. The place felt untouched, sacred even. She felt like she had stepped into a secret the desert had been keeping for centuries. Lena knelt near the edge, letting her fingers brush the cool surface. It felt impossibly pure after the day's heat, like touching the skin of another world. She wanted to capture it, the shimmer of the light on the water, the contrast between stone and bloom. But before she could lift her camera, she froze. Someone was there, across the spring. Half hidden in the shadow of the cliff, an old man knelt by the water. His hair was long and silver gray, tied loosely at the back. His skin was dark, lined deeply by sun and time. He wore a faded woven shirt and a leather band around his wrist. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, as he scooped water into his palms and let it flow over them again and again, as if performing a ritual. Lena's first instinct was to step back, to leave before he noticed her intrusion. She didn't want to disturb him, whoever he was, whatever this was. But something held her still. There was a gravity in the scene, a quiet reverence that rooted her to the spot. The way the sunlight danced across the water, the rhythm of his movements. It was like watching a prayer made visible. The man's hands rose once more, water dripping from his fingers like silver threads. Then, as if sensing her presence, he looked up. Their eyes met across the spring, met hers wide with surprise, his calm, steady, unafraid. He didn't flinch. He didn't hide his hands. He just watched her, expression unreadable, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Lena felt her heartbeat slow, her camera forgotten against her chest. She had come here to capture beauty, but this quiet human moment was something else entirely, something that felt like truth. For a long heartbeat, neither of them moved. The desert air stood still between them, as if time itself had paused to listen. The man's gaze was not startled or wary. It was calm, deep and steady like the spring he knelt beside. Lena swallowed, unsure of what to do. She had trespassed into a moment that didn't belong to her. Her camera, still hanging from her neck, suddenly felt heavy, almost shameful. A barrier between herself and what she was witnessing. The old man dipped his hands once more into the water, slow and deliberate, as though her presence hadn't disturbed him at all. The motion was graceful, almost ceremonial. He lifted the water, letting it trickle through his fingers, and the sunlight caught each droplet, scattering gold across the stones. It was the simplest act, washing one's hands. But there was something ancient about the way he did it, something that hummed with meaning. Lena took a step forward, then stopped. She didn't want to intrude, but the pull of curiosity was stronger than her hesitation. She had photographed hundreds of people all over the world, monks in Tibet, fishermen in Sri Lanka, shepherds in Morocco. Yet she had never seen anyone move with this kind of reverence. Every gesture carried the weight of memory. Every breath seemed connected to the earth around him. The man finally spoke, his voice low and even, carried softly by the desert wind. "You can come closer," he said, not as an invitation but as a statement. Calm, certain, leaving no room for fear. Lena hesitated, searching his face. There was no judgment there, only quiet acknowledgement. Slowly, she approached the edge of the spring. The air grew cooler, laced with the scent of wet stone and desert flowers. The sound of trickling water echoed softly between the canyon walls. When she reached him, he looked up again. His eyes were dark and sharp, not with suspicion, but with a kind of knowing that made her feel both seen and transparent. Up close, she could see the fine lines carved into his face like riverbeds, tracing decades of wind, sun, and memory. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't mean to disturb you." He shook his head once. "The water doesn't belong to me," he said. "It welcomes whoever needs it." She glanced at the spring, the way it reflected the sky like a mirror. "I didn't think there were springs out here," she murmured. "It feels hidden." The man smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried stories behind it. "The desert hides many things until you start to listen." His words hung in the air, soft but weighted. Lena looked at his hands, still wet, the skin dark and lined. She couldn't help but notice how careful he was with every motion, as if each handful of water was sacred. "You were washing?" she asked, unsure if that was even the right word. "Not washing," he corrected gently. "Remembering." The word struck her like a note that lingered in the air long after the sound had gone. Remembering. He continued, dipping his hands again, letting the water run over them. "We bathe our hands to remember what they've done, and what they must never forget. Every scar, every touch, every mistake. The water doesn't judge. It only reminds." Lena didn't know what to say. Her throat felt tight, and for a reason she couldn't explain, her eyes stung with the beginning of tears. She looked down at her own hands, freckled, calloused from years of holding a camera, carrying her through countless journeys, and realized how rarely she ever thought of what they carried. He noticed her silence and said quietly, "You see many things through your glass eye," nodding toward her camera. "But do you see yourself?" She looked at the camera, the polished lens reflecting the spring's light, and for the first time it didn't feel like a tool of observation, but of distance. "A shield," she shook her head. "Maybe not," she admitted softly. The man nodded once, as though that was the answer he expected. Then he scooped another handful of water, lifted it toward the sky, and let it fall slowly back into the spring. The droplets broke the reflection, turning the surface into ripples of moving light. "Every morning," he said, "I come here to give something back to the water, to remember what my hands have taken and what they can still give." Lena wanted to ask what he meant, what he had taken, what he had done, but something told her not to. Not yet. This was not a story to be extracted like a quote for a photo caption. It was something deeper, something that needed to unfold in its own rhythm like the water itself. So she stayed silent, watching him, her breath sinking with the sound of the trickling spring. The desert no longer felt empty. It felt alive, ancient, breathing, listening. And for the first time in a long while, Lena wasn't thinking about her next shot, her next exhibit, or her next story. She was simply there, present, watching the water, watching him, and waiting to understand what it meant to remember. The sun had begun its slow descent, softening the sharp edges of the canyon walls. The light turned honey gold, pooling over the stones and catching in the ripples of the spring. Lena stood at the water's edge, unsure if she should stay or step back. Something about this place and this man demanded quiet. The elder's hands moved once more, steady and patient. He cupped the water, lifted it, and let it fall. The motion was repetitive, rhythmic, but not mechanical. It was deliberate, like the slow breathing of someone in prayer. Each time the water slipped through his fingers, Lena noticed a subtle shift in his expression, a mix of sorrow and serenity. She didn't want to interrupt. She felt like she was watching something intimate, something she wasn't meant to see, yet at the same time she couldn't look away. The desert had always been still, but this stillness was different, alive, almost electric. Then without warning, the elder turned his gaze toward her. His eyes locked onto hers, not sharply, not accusingly, but as if he had been expecting her all along. There was no surprise there, no irritation at being watched, only awareness. And in that gaze, Lena felt something stir deep within her chest. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even embarrassment. It was recognition, as though this stranger, this man whose name she did not know, saw something in her that she herself had forgotten. "You watch as if you're afraid to breathe," he said finally, his voice calm, grounded in the rhythm of the earth. Lena blinked, caught off guard. "I didn't mean to intrude. He raised a hand slightly, stopping her apology before it could form. "You didn't intrude. You arrived." The way he said it, simply factually, made her heart tighten. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The desert wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the sound of distant sand shifting. "People come here all the time," he continued, "but most never see. They walk past the water and see only a reflection of themselves. You saw something more, even before you understood what it was." Lena swallowed, the words catching in her throat. "I don't even know what I saw." He gave a small, knowing smile. "That's because seeing and understanding are not the same thing." His voice carried the weight of someone who had lived long enough to know the difference. Lena found herself studying him, the way his face caught the fading light, the deep lines etched around his eyes, the quiet dignity in the way he held himself. There was a strength there, but not the kind that came from dominance or pride. It was a strength born of endurance. The man dipped his fingers into the spring again, then lifted them toward the horizon. Drops of water fell, catching the sun in brief flashes. "When I was young," he said softly, "I used to wash my hands quickly, like everyone else. Wash dry, move on. But time taught me something. Your hands remember more than your mind. They carry the memory of everything you've done, everything you've touched. You can lie with words, but not with hands." Lena watched the water drip from his fingertips, each droplet a spark of dying light. "I think I understand," she said. Though her voice wavered, he shook his head gently. "No, not yet. But you will." The way he said it wasn't condescending. It was patient, almost kind. The words lingered in her mind, unsettling and comforting all at once. She looked down at her own hands again. They were trembling, not from fear, but from something else, something she couldn't yet name. Her entire career had been about using her hands to capture the world, but suddenly she wondered how much of it she'd truly held. The man stood slowly, his movements deliberate, fluid. When he straightened, he was taller than she'd expected, his presence filling the small clearing. He turned toward the setting sun, eyes half closed, and for a brief moment Lena thought she saw a shadow of something heavy in his expression. Regret, maybe. Or remembrance. Then he looked back at her and said, "Stay until the light leaves. The desert will tell you what it remembers." And with that, he stepped away from the spring, disappearing behind a curve in the canyon wall. His figure dissolved into the deepening orange light until all that remained was the echo of his words and the soft trickle of the water. Lena stood alone now, staring at the ripples that slowly stilled where he had been. Stay until the light leaves. She knelt beside the water, her reflection shimmering on its surface, fractured, shifting, incomplete. She reached out, letting her fingers graze the surface, feeling the coolness spread through her skin. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about composition or lighting. She wasn't thinking at all. She was listening, and in that quiet, something deep within her began to wake. A feeling that the desert, the water, and the old man had all been waiting for her to find. The last light of the day bled slowly across the canyon walls, turning the sandstone into molten gold and deep rose. Shadows lengthened, merging with the water's reflection until the whole spring shimmered between day and night, suspended in a breathless pause. Lena remained where the old man had left her, knees in the cool sand, fingers still damp from the spring. The sound of water trickling over stone filled the silence. She felt as though the earth itself was whispering, not in words, but in rhythms. The rustle of the desert wind, the distant cry of a hawk, the soft pulse of flowing water. She could still hear his voice echoing in her mind. Stay until the light leaves. The desert will tell you what it remembers. It was strange, she thought, how easily he had read her. No one ever really saw her. Not in the way he had. People saw her photographs, her accolades, the polished version of her life she presented at exhibits and interviews, but not the part of her that still wandered. Searching, she dipped her hands once more into the water. It was colder now, carrying the weight of the approaching night. As she lifted her palms, the droplets fell back like tiny crystals scattering into the spring. The sound of each drop was sharp, deliberate, almost like a conversation. Lena closed her eyes. For a fleeting moment, she thought she could feel what he meant, that the water wasn't just a reflection, but a witness. Then a voice behind her said softly, "You listened." She turned. The old man was standing at the edge of the clearing again, half in shadow. He had returned so quietly that she hadn't heard his approach. His expression was calm, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," she said. He smiled faintly. "You were never alone here. The desert doesn't send you away until it's finished speaking." There was something in his tone that made her chest tighten. He stepped closer, moving with a quiet, unhurried grace that seemed to belong to another time. He gestured toward the spring, motioning for her to sit beside him. She hesitated, then obeyed. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of meaning. The man reached down, scooped water into his hands, and let it flow between his fingers. He repeated the motion slowly, his movements fluid, meditative. Lena found herself mirroring him almost without thinking. Her hands entered the spring, cupping the coolness, feeling it move and slip away. The old man nodded approvingly. "Now you understand the invitation." She looked up at him. "Invitation?" He smiled gently. "When you saw me washing, you thought you were intruding. But the water, it doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to all who remember to stop, to see. When you stood there watching, you accepted the invitation to witness, not with your camera, but with your spirit." The words sank into her like stones dropped into deep water. She stared down at her reflection. The fading light fractured her face into pieces, each ripple breaking her image apart. "I don't think I've done that in a long time," she murmured. "What is it you do?" he asked softly. "I take photographs," she said. "I try to capture moments, light, people. But lately everything feels distant, like I'm only borrowing other people's truths." He nodded thoughtfully. "When you take a picture, do you ask the land for permission?" She blinked. "The land?" "Yes," he said, his voice as steady as the wind. "Everything you take, even an image, and has a cost. The Apache say that when you take from the world, you must give something back. It doesn't have to be much, a word, a breath, gratitude. Otherwise, your hands grow heavy with what they've taken." Lena looked down at her hands again. The same hands that had clicked countless shutters, held lenses, and framed lives. They suddenly felt heavier than they ever had before. "What do I give back?" she asked quietly. He smiled, not with pity but with warmth. "That's for the water to tell you." The spring rippled as a breeze moved through the canyon. The old man's reflection shimmered beside hers, two shapes joined by light. Then he said, "Come back tomorrow when the sun rises. The water will be new again. It always is." Lena nodded slowly, her chest swelling with a feeling she couldn't quite define, something between awe and peace. As the last light faded from the rocks, the old man rose and began walking toward the canyon's shadowed path. He did not look back, nor did he say goodbye. But somehow Lena knew he didn't need to, because the invitation had already been accepted, not in words, but in silence. She stayed until the light was completely gone, her hands resting in the cool water, listening to the desert breathe around her. And for the first time in a very long time, Lena felt still, as if she too belonged to this moment of the earth remembering itself. The next morning, the desert awoke in silence. The first light crept over the horizon, turning the sandstone cliffs into glowing embers. The air was cool and still, a moment suspended between night and day. Lena had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the old man's face, the way his hands moved through the water like a slow dance between memory and forgiveness. She rose before dawn and made her way back to the canyon. Her boots crunched softly against the sand, the chill of morning biting her skin. The path felt different now, alive somehow, as if it knew she was returning for something important. When she reached the spring, the water looked untouched, glassy, and perfect. Mist hovered above it in thin ribbons. The air carried the faint scent of wet stone and juniper. She set her camera aside on a rock. Today she didn't need it. He was already there. The Apache elder sat cross-legged at the water's edge, hands resting on his knees. The rising sun painted his profile in light, giving him a kind of quiet majesty. He turned slightly when she approached, and a faint smile curved his lips. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she replied softly. He nodded once, approving. "Then you're ready to listen." Lena sat across from him, mirroring his posture. The spring glimmered between them, reflecting the newborn sun. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not awkward. It was sacred, like the hush before a song. Then the elder dipped his hands into the water, lifting them slowly until the droplets ran down his wrists. "Do you know why I come here every morning?" he asked. Lena shook her head. He watched the ripples spread across the surface. "When I was young," he began, "my hands were strong and proud. They built shelters, hunted, made fire. They learned to shape arrows and carve stone. They did what they were taught to do. But they also learned something darker." He paused, letting the wind fill the space between his words. "There was a time when our people fought, not for land or gold, but for survival. I was told that fighting was the only way to protect what we had left. And so I fought. These hands," he said, turning them over in the sunlight, "took lives." The words were quiet, almost carried away by the breeze. Yet they struck Lena like a stone to the chest. He continued, his gaze steady on the water. "It doesn't matter how noble the reason sounds when the drum beats. The blood still stains the same. When I grew older, the war ended, but the weight stayed here." He placed one hand over his heart. "You can't wash it away with soap or time. Only with truth." Lena listened, her throat tight. She wanted to speak and to offer something, a word of comfort. But the depth of his calm stopped her. There was no self-pity in his tone, no performance. Only acceptance. "So you come here to—" she began, then hesitated. "To remember," he finished. "To honor what I did, not with pride, but with honesty. These hands once took life. Now they return life." He scooped another handful of water and released it gently into the spring. "The water carries memory. Every drop that leaves here travels to another place, in the rivers, the sky, the rain. When I wash, I ask the water to take what I can't carry anymore. And I give back what I can, my gratitude, my prayer, my remorse." The words wrapped around her like the warmth of the sun climbing higher in the sky. Lena stared at the water. "And does it work?" she asked softly. "Does the guilt ever go away?" The old man's eyes met hers, ancient and kind. "Guilt isn't meant to go away," he said. "It's meant to be transformed. The same way water changes, from ice to rain, from river to cloud. You can't destroy what you feel. You can only change its shape." He leaned forward, scooping another handful of water. "Every morning I let the water teach me what it means to forgive, not others but myself. Because forgiveness is the only way your hands can stay open to the world." Lena felt her eyes blur with tears. Her hands trembled slightly, resting on her knees. She thought of all the moments she had taken, faces of strangers, landscapes, lives captured through glass. How many had she truly given something back to? The elder watched her quietly, then said, "You carry things too. Maybe not blood, but loss. Maybe not violence, but forgetting. We all do. That's why you're here." She nodded slowly, unable to speak. The truth of his words sank deep into her bones. For the first time, she reached for the water on her own. She cupped her hands, lifted them, and let the coolness slip through her fingers. It felt like a small surrender, a wordless promise to start again. The old man smiled faintly, seeing what she couldn't yet say. "Good," he murmured. Now your hands remember too. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage through the canyon. The morning light danced across the spring, and in that moment, Lena felt something uncoil inside her. Not vanish, but soften. She finally understood what he meant. That remembering was not punishment. It was the beginning of peace. The sun had climbed high enough now that the shadows had begun to retreat from the canyon walls. The spring shimmered, brighter and more alive than before. Lena sat quietly beside the old Apache elder, her palms resting in her lap, still damp from the ritual he had shown her. The water's touch lingered on her skin, cool and grounding. He said nothing for a long while, and neither did she. It was a silence that didn't demand to be filled, the kind of silence that held its own truth. Finally, the man spoke. "Do you know what the water is teaching you?" Lena looked at him, unsure how to answer. "I think so," she said cautiously. "That it cleanses, that it takes things away." He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "That's what most people believe. They think water only washes away, but that is only half its story." He cupped his hands again, filling them with the clear spring water. The sunlight caught the droplets, turning them into tiny jewels that sparkled between his fingers. "Water doesn't just take," he said. "It remembers. It carries. It transforms." He lifted his hands to the light and let the water fall back into the spring, watching the ripples fan out. "Every time you touch it, you are touching every place it has ever been. The ocean, the rain, the tears of someone who lived 1,000 years ago, the river that once cut through this desert. It's all the same water, just changed by time." Lena listened, her gaze following the movement of his hands. The simplicity of what he said felt enormous, like something her body already knew but her mind had never understood. "So when you wash," he continued, "you are not erasing what you've done. You are offering it back, giving it to something larger than yourself so it can be carried forward, reshaped." Lena frowned slightly, her voice soft. "Carried forward how?" He looked at her with patient eyes. "When you wash your hands in the spring, you are telling the world what you are ready to release. The water will carry it. Maybe it will rain somewhere far away and touch another soul who needs to feel what you've let go. Or maybe it will return here to remind someone else that healing isn't about forgetting." She stared at the rippling water, letting his words sink in. "Healing isn't about forgetting. How do you know what to let go of?" she asked. The old man's gaze softened. "The same way you know when to breathe out," he said. "The body always knows what it's holding. The hard part is listening." Lena nodded slowly. She looked down at her reflection. It was fractured again, rippled by movement, never still, never perfect. For years she had tried to capture stillness in her photographs, freezing the world in frames of light. But now she saw the truth. Stillness was never real. Life was always moving, always flowing, just like the water. The elder dipped his fingers again, brushing the surface of the spring. "When I was young," he said, "I used to fear what the water might take from me. My anger, my memories, even my identity. I thought letting go meant losing. But I was wrong. The water doesn't take what you are. It reveals what's underneath." Lena thought about the moments she had tried to bury, the failures, the heartbreaks, the guilt she carried for the people she'd left behind in pursuit of her work. She'd always imagined that moving forward meant leaving those things behind. But now she realized they were part of her story. The trick wasn't to erase them. It was to let them transform. The elder seemed to read her thoughts. "You see?" he said gently. "The water teaches balance. It accepts everything, the clean and the dirty, the calm and the storm. That's why it endures. Humans spend their lives trying to control what they feel, what they remember. But water, it just is. It flows, always forward, always changing, yet always itself." Lena smiled faintly, her eyes bright with understanding. "Always forward," she repeated. He nodded. "Even when it seems still, it moves. Even when it seems gone, it returns. The lesson is simple. Don't try to hold what must flow." The spring glittered between them as a breeze swept through the canyon, stirring tiny ripples across the surface. The elder reached into the water once more, then held out his wet palms toward her. "You carry stories too," he said. "Every image you've taken, every place you've been, they live in your hands. When you touch the water, you decide which ones to keep." Lena looked at her own hands again, then slowly mirrored his gesture. Together they dipped their palms into the spring. The ripples spread outward, merging into one. She felt something loosen, not a burden falling away all at once, but a gradual softening, a letting go she hadn't known she needed. The elder's voice was barely above a whisper. Let the water carry what you no longer wish to bear. Let it remember for you. The desert wind hushed, and for that moment, the days began to pass in rhythm with the desert. Slow, deliberate, sacred. Each morning, Lena returned to the spring before sunrise. The Apache elder was always there, as if he belonged to the place as much as the stones and the light. He never greeted her with words, but with silence, a kind of acknowledgement that spoke louder than language. At first, Lena simply watched. Then she began to imitate. She learned the movements of his ritual, how he cupped his hands, how he lifted the water, how he let it fall back without grasping for it. It seemed simple, but it wasn't. The act demanded presence, a surrender of thought, a release of control. The more she practiced, the more she began to notice the quiet details she had missed before. The way sunlight shifted across the canyon walls as the morning grew, the hum of unseen insects waking in the reeds, the slow expansion of her own breath as her body learned the rhythm of the land. And in that stillness, her mind began to unspool. One morning, as the elder poured water over his hands, he said, "The desert keeps secrets only until you are ready to hear them." Lena looked up from her reflection. "And what if you never are?" he smiled. "Then you keep walking until you are." She thought about that as she stared into the spring. The water reflected her face, older than she remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. For years she had moved from country to country, story to story, camera to camera, running really, though she had never called it that. She had been running from the one story she couldn't capture, her own, her father's illness. The day she didn't make it home in time to say goodbye. The way her mother's voice had broken when she said, "He waited for you." That was the first picture Lena had never taken, the one moment she couldn't bear to freeze. And from that day on, she had kept moving, chasing light and people and landscapes, anything to fill the silence that had followed her. But the silence had found her here, sitting beside a man who had once taken life and now offered it back. Day after day, the elder broke the stillness with a quiet question. "What do your hands remember?" Lena looked at them, small, freckled, calloused. "I think they remember." "Leaving," she whispered. "Always leaving." He nodded slowly. "Then you know what they need to learn." "What's that?" she asked. "To stay." The word settled into her chest like a stone dropping into deep water. He motioned to the spring. "The water never asks where it's been. It only asks where it's going. You can't change what your hands have done, but you can decide what they will do next." Lena stared at the reflection of her hands trembling just above the surface. Slowly she dipped them in, feeling the shock of cold seep into her skin. "What if I don't know what comes next?" she murmured. The elder smiled softly. "Then let the water carry you until you do." She closed her eyes and let the water run between her fingers, imagining the things she wanted to release. The guilt, the distance, the endless running. She pictured them dissolving into the spring, small invisible threads joining something larger. When she finally opened her eyes, the light had shifted again. The elder was watching her, his gaze calm, approving. "You listened," he said. Lena nodded, tears she hadn't meant to shed slipping down her cheeks. "I think I'm starting to." He dipped his hands one last time, then rose, brushing sand from his palms. "When the desert teaches you silence," he said, "you must use your voice differently, not to fill the quiet, but to honor it." He began to walk away, leaving her alone with the water once more. But this time, the silence didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like belonging. Lena sat there for a long while, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't reach for her camera. She didn't think of her next destination. She just breathed, slowly, evenly, as the desert morning unfolded around her. Something inside her had shifted. Not erased, not replaced, transformed. For the first time, she didn't feel like a visitor in the world. She felt like part of it. Years passed, but the desert never left her. Even as Lena's life returned to the hum of cities and airports and exhibition halls, she carried that canyon inside her. The spring, the light, the silence that had once taught her how to breathe again. Her photographs began to change. People noticed it before she did. They said her work had depth now, that there was a calmness in the way she captured faces, a sense of reverence in the way she framed landscapes. The critics used words like transcendent and intimate, but Lena only smiled politely when they asked about her new vision. She knew it wasn't new at all. It was what had always been there. She had simply learned how to see it. Her camera was no longer a shield, no longer a tool for collecting other people's truths. It had become an instrument of listening. She no longer chased moments. She waited for them. She no longer sought beauty. She recognized it, in the quiet gestures, in the pauses between words, in the way light touched the smallest, most forgotten things, and yet, every photograph she took carried an echo of the spring, the shimmer of water, the warmth of stone, the memory of a man whose hands had taught her how to release. The first time she returned to Arizona, it was spring again. The desert was in bloom, wildflowers scattered across the red earth, splashes of yellow and violet breaking through the dust. She drove the same dirt road she'd once taken years ago, following it back to the canyon that had changed everything. The path was harder to find this time, as if the desert was testing whether she truly remembered. But she did. Her feet found the rhythm again and her heart guided the rest. When she reached the spring, the sight took her breath away. It was just as she remembered. The same stillness, the same cool shimmer of water beneath the stone. Yet something was different. The place felt quieter. The elder was not there. For a long moment, Lena stood at the edge of the water, her reflection trembling beside the memory of his. She had known this might happen, that the day would come when she would return and find only the echo of his presence. But somehow, it didn't feel like loss. She knelt and dipped her hands into the spring. The water was cold, clear, alive. As it ran through her fingers, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." It was not a prayer. It was a promise. To remember, to give back, to keep listening. When she opened her eyes, the water seemed to shimmer brighter, as if the earth itself was acknowledging her words. The wind stirred, brushing her cheek, and for a fleeting second she thought she heard his voice again. Soft, steady, carried by the air. "You see, the water remembers." She smiled, tears warming her eyes. Months later, her new exhibition opened in New York. It was called The Shape of Water. The gallery was dimly lit, filled with large unframed prints, not of people or cities, but of reflections, pools, rivers, springs, droplets on skin. Viewers moved through the space in silence. There was no music, no chatter, only the soft sound of water trickling through hidden speakers, echoing the rhythm of the desert spring. At the center of the gallery stood a single photograph. It wasn't the most striking or colorful image, but people always lingered before it longest. It showed two pairs of hands hovering above a desert spring, one aged and lined, the other young and trembling, the moment just before the water touched them both. Beneath the image, in small simple letters, the caption read, "These hands once took life. Now they return it." It was the elder's voice, his truth, but also hers now. Lena watched quietly from the edge of the room as people stood before the photo, absorbed. Some leaned closer, some closed their eyes. A few even smiled softly as if something unspoken had reached them. And in that moment, Lena realized the circle was complete. The elder had given his story to the water, and the water had carried it to her. And now, through her art, it was being carried again, passed like a ripple through all who came to see. As the last visitor left and the gallery fell silent, Lena stood before the photograph one final time. She traced the image of the hands with her eyes and whispered, "It's still flowing." And though no one was there to hear it, the air seemed to answer, the faint, eternal sound of water moving somewhere beyond walls and cities, carrying memory forward. Always changing, always returning, always flowing.